everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a wonderful guest with us today. We have Scott Dyer with Rameumptom Ruminations. How are you, Scott?
Hey, Landon. Hey, Rebecca. Thanks for having me on.
We've been wanting to have you on for quite a while. It took me a while to learn how to pronounce the name of your amazing podcast. So I had to work on that very hard. So I did not stutter on the air. But
I appreciate it. You got it.
Yeah, no, we are thrilled. Rameumptom Ruminations is just I'll say right up front, if any of our viewers or listeners have not tuned into this, you will not be disappointed. This is a wonderful podcast, and we'll get into this more as we talk to Scott. So let's start out. I think Landon has the bio, as we usually do. Let's read Scott's bio really quick and then just dive right in.
Okay, Scott is a guy with a microphone and way too much to say about a church that he left years ago. He's the host of Rameumptom Ruminations podcast under the umbrella of the Mormon Discussions podcast brand. Living in a mixed faith marriage influences the tone of his podcast. He strives to publish content that is true to the data and his own feelings while creating an approachable space to both the newly doubting and the nuanced believer. And I believe he's also a great cook and makes great cakes.
Yes, in fact, we do have a slide. I will have to tell you, we had a little pre-meeting with Scott and we were chatting and he was mentioning, all right, see you guys later. I'm off to make my daughter's birthday cake. And I said, oh, cake, and he mentioned a cake. I said, you have to send us a picture. So a day later, this shows up in our inbox and we're just like, is there nothing this man cannot do? He's an amazing podcaster, an amazing person. And look at this cake, everybody. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was a 6-tier rainbow cake with vanilla sponge, which I made everything by scratch. I also made the buttercream frosting, and it was a coconut buttercream frosting, and it was perfect. It turned out so good. And my little 3-year-old loved it. And so did I. Part of it's making for me because I enjoy this stuff.
That is just incredible. Now we're having a Mormonish culinary moment, everyone, if you're just joining us. My
arteries are hardening just
I know, that's what I feel like. I'm like,
it was a big cake. And since it was so tall, all you needed was just like a real thin slice.
I'm trying to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's incredible. And you made everything from scratch.
From scratch. I had to do it over the course of 3 or 4 days. And then I was freezing the sponges. I'd make a couple of sponges and then freeze them and then make a couple more the next day and then freeze them and then just assemble them all the day of her birthday.
Oh, is your daughter just thrilled? Like, my daddy made me a cake. Like, that is amazing. Seriously.
Yes. Anytime they see sweets, all of my children are like, that's what you need to make me for my birthday.
So they know that you have many passions and many talents, and I just think that's the cutest thing ever.
I have too many hobbies. I'm going to make her wedding cake. That's in the future.
That would be a challenge. That actually would be fun.
You might have to start planning now. That's right. I bet you could do it. There's a number of years to go. But and I bet your wife thinks it's so fun, because that's always the big stress, right? Usually the mom is the one, oh my gosh, the cake. Do I make it? Do I buy it? But in this case, it's handled. That's perfect.
Yeah. And my wife is an excellent cook in her own right, so
I'm sure
we're a great team where that comes.
Oh, that is awesome. Well, we've seen cake, everybody. Now let's get, and I have to admit that did make me we may have to get some cake later today, Landon. I'm just saying.
I never pass on cake.
Yeah, you get that fixed in your mind. You're like, I can't think of anything.
That's a man who's never passed on cake.
That's right.
We don't ever reveal the lower half of the camera to our viewers, right? We keep the facade.
I rarely show my face to my viewers.
I know. Oh, is that true? Now that's going to be interesting then. Oh, this is the big reveal of Scott. This is awesome.
I've done 3 episodes that have shown my face. So this will be the 4th. This will be the 4th.
This will be the 4th.
Yeah,
well,
you don't look like a Rameumptom. I gotta say.
What would that look like, do you think, Landon?
Big,
I was expecting maybe a pharaoh looking, someone who looks like Pharaoh or something. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Too funny.
Oh my gosh. Well, we will get into all that, how we named the podcast and all of that. But first, I think our viewers would just be curious. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about you growing up and how you kind of found yourself where you are right now? We would love to hear more about that as we just have a conversation.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how much you want me to go into this, but I'm born and raised in the LDS Church. I am from the Pacific Northwest and just outside of Portland in the Portland metropolitan area. I I am 5 of 6 in my family, and in my entire extended family, everybody is part of the church. And that's even the case today. I've actually got, there's only, I think, 2 cousins that I know of on my one side that have left, and maybe 3 on the other side that have left the LDS church. So most of my family is still in and practicing, and both the extended family as well. So I'm kind of the outlier in my own immediate familial group. Anyway, so born and raised LDS church, just a kind of a typical upbringing, learning all the things, doing all the scouts and the weekly activities. Through much of my childhood, a lot of my mental struggles were undiagnosed. I've talked a little bit about on my podcast. I have struggled with depression for a number of years. As a kid, undiagnosed ADHD. I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult, and all the baggage that comes along with depression and ADHD, and not really understanding why my brain is functioning differently than everybody around me. Anyway, all of that on its own is a big struggle, but then compounding that with an unhealthy internalization of the repentance process made it was a really bad combination for me. So I really struggled with my mental health as a practicing Mormon, both in my teenage years and in my 20s. So I was a member of the church, believing and active for the majority of my 20s. I started deconstructing slowly over those years, but really it accelerated when I turned 30, and that led me to where I am today. I mean, feel free to ask any questions or dig into anything that I've said. But
you said you had depression, that you unhealthy internalization of the repentance process. I know Rebecca just did a podcast on the Shiny Happy People episode.
Yeah.
And I watched that. She had me watch that, and I was interested to see that when they go to their therapist would right away say, "You're showing the signs of somebody who was in a high demand religion." Is that the way you saw things? Did you see things like, oh, it's this high demand religion, this pursuit of excellence, or can you go into a bit more what that depression? Because I think a lot of people experience that in the post-Mormon world.
Yeah. So the way that I had internalized the repentance process, whenever something bad would happen, I would automatically assume it was because there was something that I was doing wrong. So an argument with my wife, oh no, what did I do wrong? There's something bad happens at work. Oh no, what do I need to repent for to make sure that everything in my life is perfect? And so I had internalized it in such a way that if I wanted to be happy, then I needed to make sure that I was 100% perfect, because I had associated in my head this basically that if something went wrong, it was my fault, not that things could happen outside of my control. And I know that's totally wrong, and I've done a lot of healing since, but as an active believing member, oops, I bumped my desk. As a believing member, that's how I kind of internalized this repentance process, where if I wanted to have perfect peace and harmony and everything, I needed to always be repenting of something. And so it was really unhealthy, and it led to really self-deprecating thought patterns and really intense depression. I use humor as a defense mechanism. So if I make a joke, that's because I'm hurting on the inside as I'm talking about this.
Did you go on a mission, and did that play into this? Where you, I mean, a lot of times my mission, it was very difficult. You never had success, and you felt like, am I not having, you never thought, oh, well, it's because it's a weird doctrine, or that nobody wants to hear it. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Otherwise I'd be having baptisms. And then you start feeling bad about yourself. Did that play into it? And did that add to it or take away from it? And where did you serve, if you did?
Yeah. So I served from 2006 to 2008 in Chile. So Chile, Concepcion Sur. So I was in like the southern third of the country. It's a long, narrow country, narrow stretch of land. The way I had internalized it, I had a lot of success. So let me preface this with, it was almost the opposite, but had the same effect. So I had these same sort of patterns. I was pushing myself to be as righteous as possible, follow all the rules as strictly as I could. And I baptized a lot of people, like way more people than anybody else in my family. And it, to me, that like made this concept more concrete in my mind, that if I try to be as exact and obedient as possible, then I will be blessed. I think there were only 2 weeks of my whole mission where I didn't baptize somebody. Like, I had a baptism almost every week, and there was a while where it was like multiple baptisms a week. It was crazy. It was crazy.
You're a legend. I'm guessing people are probably still talking about you in the field.
Elder Rameumptom.
Elder Rameumptom. They're probably holding you up against other missionaries and say, he was able to do it decades ago. Why not you, right?
Well, it was in my mission, we did have a lot of success. There were people that I was like average, if you will. Like, I was in like the middle of the pack. So we had a lot of baptisms. So it served the same, as you said, Landon, like it made this idea more concrete in my mind, where this connection between like an unhealthy perfectionism to my faith, and it just kind of made that idea more firm in my mind. So
yeah, I think that's very common, though, and the idea that nothing is just a random occurrence. It just happened to happen, and you deal with it. No, there's some part of it, a large part of it, that you are responsible for. And I think as we get on the other side of it, we find that is so incredibly unhealthy, especially in children, because what you're describing to me is a very young child understanding that, something went wrong. Me, what did I do? I'm broken. I'm the problem. That leads to, like you said, depression, scrupulosity, where people are, and always second guessing your own intuition. Don't you find sort of like I think something, but is that the Holy Ghost? Is that, did you have those kinds of feelings? We talked to a lot of people where it's never just, I had a random thought. It's there for a reason. Everything has such a heightened purpose. Did you ever feel that, where your own intuition was just gone because it's God talking to you, or Satan, or crazy? That was something that maybe when I was younger, I had a more firm idea of that. But as a believer, I never found a good answer for when Satan can speak into your mind or when God can speak into your mind, and how to distinguish between the two. There's nothing really concrete. So that was something that I never really had a good grasp on. And so I just took ownership of it all.
Aren't you supposed to ask to shake their hand or something like
that? That's true. That's true.
No, and I'm talking about maybe like the Holy Ghost, like a lot of people are like, I'm not going to make a move. I had a roommate in college like that, like literally not a move. The Holy Ghost told me I should not go to class today. I don't know why. Something's going to happen. But I'm like, well, isn't that convenient? But I mean,
you're probably going to fail. That's what's going to happen.
Exactly. But it goes along with that scrupulosity, where you're never yourself. It's your fault, or there's some other signals coming into you, and you can never be authentic or even live your own life, basically. You don't see that, I think, until you're on the other side of it.
Scott, you said you saw a lot of miracles on your mission, or you participated in a lot of that. How did that play into your mindset?
So at this point in my life, I am very faithful, fully in, 100% believing. And I was a part of, casting out spirits and healings. And there was even a number of elders in my mission that would call me the prophet Dyer. So instead of Elder Dyer, they'd call me the prophet Dyer, because it seemed like these things were just following me. And there was healings, people that were sick, you put your hand on them and they're like suddenly better, that sort of thing. There was a time where the buses were down and a whole group of us had to like walk across this town to get to this appointment, and it was just pouring rain and everybody was complaining, and I'm like, guys, why don't we just like command the rains to stop and then just keep going? And everyone was like, that doesn't work. And I'm like, well, let's try it out. And I did, hand to the square. I'm like, all right, let's see if our priesthood even works. And then like within minutes, the rain stopped and everybody like looked at me like, what on earth is happening? Then we just walked. And as soon as we got to where we were going, the rain started again. Like it was for me at the time, it was a very spiritual, like motivating experience But then I would also, so that was like the first half of my mission. Everything's like was more positive, but then the second half, they didn't always work out. There was another one that was cool too. That was like a positive experience. We had this baptism, and the power was out in the church building, and the water was off, and it was my last week in the area, and it was this woman that I had been teaching for the whole like 3 months that I was there, and she was finally getting baptized, and the lights were out, there was no water, and everyone was like, well, I guess we'll have to reschedule it for next week. And I'm like, no, this is happening now. And so I knelt down and I'm like, all right, God, I can figure out the water if you can figure out the lights. And as soon as I finished the prayer, the lights in the chapel turned on, and I was like, all right, I guess I got to figure out the water. So I called the fire department, and I had the fire department. I was like, hey, are you guys busy? Can you help me out? And they came in. Her daughter was a firefighter, so that was kind of how I had the connection there. I was like, hey, can you fill the chapel? We're trying to baptize your mom. And so they brought in a fire truck and filled the font, and that's how we baptized her. The water was disgusting, but we made it work. Anyway, so I had a lot of like actual.
So she was baptized by water and fire.
And fire department. Yes.
Yes. So I had a lot of experiences like that on like the first half of my mission. The second half, they didn't always work out, and it really caused some doubt in my mind on the efficacy of miracles and the priesthood. One of my companions had an ingrown toenail, and he was unable to walk. It was so painful for him that he couldn't walk, and so we were stuck not teaching. And so I'm like, well, we're here to teach. Why don't we just like bless it to get better, and then we can go out and about our day? And we tried it, and nothing happened. Like his foot didn't magically heal, and it was like I was distraught. Like my faith was shaken because it didn't work. Like all of these other experiences leading up to this, and I'm like, why is this not working when all of the other ones did? And there were some other experiences too that happened, but that was like one of the big ones where I'm like, okay, maybe it doesn't work all the time. Maybe it's not associated, because at the time on my mission that I was the most obedient that I ever was in my entire time as a member of the church. So it should have worked. I mean, there wasn't anything that I was doing wrong, and it still didn't work. And that really bothered me.
That is so interesting. So you didn't do soul searching and say, what am I doing wrong? Because you knew you were doing everything correct. And yet the result was not what you expected, because it's very cause and effect. I mean, if you take it in that black and white way, I'm obedient, I'm righteous, I need this for the Lord's work. There's absolutely no reason that it should happen. Did you ever think, oh, this is a test? I know that's another loophole too. Then you're like, I have the faith not to be healed or to be able to heal, because I mean, there's always something, another gymnastic that you can do to go through it, right?
Or did you ask your companion, are you doing something wrong?
That's it. You're not righteous enough to be healed. That's the answer.
No, that's how I internalized it. Because so afterwards, if thinking about it, I'm like, okay, since I know that I have the faith to do these big miracles, it must have been that my companion didn't have the faith. Oh, not that it couldn't have happened, but I put all of that responsibility on him in my mind. So sorry, Nico, if you're probably not listening, you don't speak English, but I apologize for putting that burden on you back then.
Right. But it's the only logical answer, because cause effect, you're righteous enough, the work needs to go forward. That's the only logical answer. There's no such thing as randomness in a church of certainty. You know what I mean? Nothing. And so to me, being on the other side of Mormonism, the idea of randomness, and Landon and I have talked about this a lot, randomness to me is very comforting, because I don't have to dig deep to find out why that happened. It just happened. And now I'll deal with it. There's no meaning, there's no cause. I can make of it what it is. I can certainly learn lessons from it. I can take positive influence from it.
And
but
you certainly
it just
don't
happens.
have to feel bad or guilty because it happened to you.
That's it. So no, I love no certainty, and I love randomness. And some people, even in post-Mormons, will say, I don't understand that. And I'm like, nope, it's very comforting to me. Even when it comes to a situation like very dramatically, like a death or something like that, I just feel it's more comforting to realize this is kind of randomly happening. And I always thought I felt that way. And then I had a situation I've talked about before, where my older son, when he was very young, 10, in the hospital, pneumonia, it was life or death. He was not getting better, primary children's. and everybody around me was, praying and asking for miracles and blessings. And I thought, okay, pedal to the metal. What do I think about this situation? And I went, I think it's just randomly happened to my son. He just got pneumonia and it's not getting better and the antibiotics aren't working. I'm not thinking about a higher power to contact. I'm really sending good vibes to the doctors, that they'll be able to figure it out. But that was a moment of realization for me that I really do believe in randomness, found it comforting, and was able to take action from there as I could, So for me, that was interesting. Other people would think that was not a great way to look at it, but for me, it worked. So
yeah,
I don't know, randomness.
I feel like coming from where I was with this perfectionist mentality, when I landed, when I was confronted with nihilism after deconstructing the church, this sort of randomness and purposeless universe that we live in, it was comforting for me as well. If there's no meaning in all of this chaos, then I can define the meaning in my own life. And taking ownership of that was really healing for me.
Yeah, that's a beautiful concept. And I think our viewers should know that this is the kind of topic that he'll talk about on his podcast in just such a wonderful, healing way. No, I'm not kidding. You are very affirming in your podcast to people. And, you give these answers in such a great way that I think you walk away with a different kind of mindset, which is, like I said, very healing, very positive. So, okay, so you're on your mission, you leave your mission.
Yeah.
Now you're obviously going to school, getting married, you're doing all the things because you're a faithful Mormon. I bet I could guess your life from here to
I bet you could.
A point.
Yeah. So, all the things, marriage, school. I went to BYU, Idaho. That's where I met my wife, and we were married there. We graduated at the same time. We both slowed down our studies, where we were taking like 14, 16 credits a semester, but we decided to bump it down to 12 so we could graduate at the same time, because we were on different semester tracks. So that was kind of cool. I got to walk with her. During that time, maybe the last nail in the coffin for miracles for me was when we had a miscarriage. And this was a really painful moment, both for her because she went through a lot of pain through this miscarriage, but also for my faith. Now, I didn't rock her faith as much as it did mine. I came into this, again, having 100% faith in the power of miracles, the power of healing. And when maybe I'll get a little graphic here, so, content warning, if you will. When she started spotting while she was pregnant, and that's blood coming down, I gave her a blessing, and I felt prompted to bless her that the little one would be healed and that everything would be fine, and that everything would work out as it was supposed to. There's no purpose. Like, if there is a purpose in everything in this life, like, what purpose would there be in an infant's death? That doesn't make sense. Or I gotta close my door. Hold on a second. Sorry. There's a lot of noise outside, and so I'm gonna.
Oh no, I get it. We have dogs and all kinds of things. I don't even think we need to edit this out because this is the kind of show we have, isn't it, Landon? We love it. Life goes on. That's at the beginning when we were podcasting, I tried to be really perfect, but now I'm like, our viewers have got to know we've got pets, we've got children, we've got neighbors. It's just happening. So that's all right.
So we go through the whole process. The miscarriage happens, and that I remember, like, vividly, putting this clump of matter, this little tiny unformed fetus, into the garbage can, because the miscarriage happened in our parking lot as we were walking back to our house that night. And I set it down on top of a Ben and Jerry's ice cream container, and it stuck with me. I wrote an essay about it at the time, all the emotions that were going through my head. But from that moment on, and I was probably 24, maybe 25, I stopped believing in the power of the priesthood to heal and miracles altogether. That stopped being a part of the way I practiced the LDS faith. I still believed, but that aspect of it, I no longer kept with me.
That must have been difficult based on all the positive experiences you had on a mission, where you were able to make things that maybe didn't seem, stop the rain or whatever. So you could walk from here to there, but you couldn't heal your own wife and child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was devastating to me.
So did that you say you're still believing at this point, but did that put a certain lens on you that you started to view other things based on now, because that's a big one to say, I don't think the priesthood is what they've told me. I mean, I wonder now what lens you're seeing things through. Yeah,
I tend to overthink things and to rethink things. For any listeners out there, they might get an idea of that. I'll sit down with an idea and think about it from a lot of different perspectives, read as much as I can about it to try and understand it. And I still held faith in basically every of the core doctrines. I just didn't believe that was something that was real or observable in our world. And other things happened down the road. There was a time where one of my sons, I only have one son, my son was sick, and I wasn't there at the time, and the missionaries were there with my in-laws, and they gave him a blessing, and he was healed. And my wife calls me about it, and we're talking about it, and I'm like, you also gave him medicine though, and like the medicine did what it was supposed to do. And that was still as a believer. I really just abandoned this whole concept.
That's so interesting. Did you take it to a scriptural level? If you're really thinking that there is no priesthood, did you go there at all going, well, then wait a minute, what?
I didn't allow myself to mentally go there fully. Right. For some of the more ancient things I did, I love history. It's one of the things that I'm just really passionate about. And a lot of the things in the Old Testament, I allowed myself to look at more critically. But New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, those were kind of on a different pedestal in my mind. And I didn't allow myself to think critically about them.
There's a reason there aren't a lot of historians higher up in the church. I think that's why they call lawyers instead of historians, because I think almost anyone who has a love of history, it seems like, ends up going there, to where this, just doesn't pass some of the critical tests when you start studying the history of things. So. Definitely. But you were called as a gospel doctrine teacher, right?
Yeah, I held a number of different callings. Gospel doctrine was one of them. I was, stake young men's and all the different presidencies. I served in a lot of different callings. But as a gospel doctrine teacher, that forced me to reconcile some of these problems that I had just been putting aside for almost a decade. So I was called into gospel doctrine, and I taught 3 years. And the last year that I taught was the Old Testament. And by the time that year was done, my faith was completely gone. I still maintained faith when I was teaching the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Mormon. But when I took the opportunity to dive really deep into history to understand better the context of the scriptures, and that completely eroded my faith in the Old Testament, but not in the rest of it. And there's a funny story. I'm a pretty big nerd. For any of the viewers or watching, I've got all sorts of like tabletop board rule books there, Call of Cthulhu. I've got Pathfinder and all sorts of things. So I play D&D at least every other week, and I've played with a group of friends for a number of years. And one of my closest friends, his name's Paul, also at the time was a deconstructing member of the LDS Church. We would play Dungeons and Dragons, and then all of our friends would leave, and then he and I would talk about some of the problems that we were having, or we talk about our faith, we talk about our depression. He's a very, very dear friend of mine. In those conversations, I brought up the fact that I no longer believed in the Old Testament. And I was just, talking about some of the grandiose things that happened in Genesis specifically. And I'm like, none of those things are historical. And, I'm talking about all these different books that I'd read. And he looks at me like really funny. He's like, that they talk about the Tower of Babel and the flood and all of those things in the Book of Mormon, right? And it was like one moment to the next. Like he made that comment. Right before he made that comment, I was a 100% full in believer. He says that one comment to me, and the next second, everything shattered, and I didn't believe in anything anymore. And it, like, because those stories were treated as historical, it just, the entire validity of the Book of Mormon shattered, and then everything else came crumbling down with it.
The Old Testament took me out too. That was it's the foundation. It's you can't have anything else without the Old Testament. And when you study that, and it falls. But it's amazing to me how the church now is going. We're actually putting together another podcast right now on DNA and the Book of Mormon. And as we're reading the essay, you know, the church says, well, the Book of Mormon is spiritual, not historical. And you're going, how can any of these miracles or these spiritual things be true if it's not historical? Then none of this stuff happened. It's not really even spiritual at that point, because these are just made up stories at that point.
Yeah, it's huge. For me, it just all came crashing down. If you look at it with like a metaphorical or a mythological lens, I think that maybe you could still have value in it, but it has serious implications on some of the core practices within the faith. If the Book of Mormon is a myth story, not a historical story, what does that mean about our practice of baptisms for the dead, or the practice of polygamy, or the practice of, name the practice? If it's not historical, if it's not 100% true account, what does that mean about the daily practices of the LDS Church? That doesn't mean that they all have to be thrown out, but I think it should force a listener, or force someone who's critically thinking about this, to reassess, maybe there are some unhealthy practices that we have within the church. If it is a myth story, maybe we can just get rid of the bad stuff and keep all of the good.
I muted. My dog was snoring. I didn't want anyone to think it was me, right? So
that's all right.
What's that sound she's making? I was going to say that is a wonderful way to look at it. And I think some people, they can go their whole lives without realizing the connection between the foundational stories, and like dominoes, you just take it. In fact, I wonder if one of you would just very quickly explain, maybe some of our viewers don't know the connection with the Tower of Babel and the Book of Mormon itself. I mean, like you said, it dropped right there. But for others, it's just, you don't go there. So it's a pretty clear connection to me. Maybe just go into it for 1 second, just so our viewers understand what we're talking about.
So the Tower of Babel the story is set up as a story to describe how different languages come into the world. It's also like an anti-Babylonian propaganda. The tower is described, it's like the 8th or the 7th century, there's a temple in Babylon that's kind of being perpetually rebuilt. And that's kind of what the story is making fun of a little bit. And so it's got some imagery, and it's referring to that. So it's kind of digging at the Babylonians. Anyway, but it's not something that actually happened like historically thousands of years prior to that. So understanding where it came from in its context made me realize that it just was not a historical event. But the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon uses the story of the Tower of Babel as a jumping off point to tell the story of the brother of Jared and their family coming to the Americas. And so it treats this mythological story as a historical event within the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon.
And once you realize that first didn't happen, then everything else is suspect from there. So, But you're right. I mean, mythology is important, but when it informs all those daily practices that maybe you're uncomfortable with or don't work for you, and you continue doing them because you believe basically that God has told you to do these practices. There's no way you can ever think for yourself about it. So now knowing it's like I always make this joke to Landon. I compare it to Harry Potter, which I love the whole series. I literally probably could live my life with the principles and the tenets of Harry Potter. I also play D&D. I'm a fantasy
very
person
cool.
like that. Yeah, no. In fact, when I read that in your bio, I'm like, oh, good. Some geeky people. It's the way it is. But, and to me, there are a lot of great principles and practices in the wizarding world, that I could use in the same way that people use the Book of Mormon. But of course, I can never tell myself that Harry Potter is real. It's not real. So I may pick and choose scenarios. I may get emotional when I read it. I may feel elevated emotion, which I do when I read the series over.
Yeah.
I'm revealing my geekdom to everybody here, but it's the same thing. You know what I mean? But I'm not going to force myself to do the things that are in those books, because I don't, it's not from God. It's not historical. And if you realize that about the scriptures, where does that leave you? It's a very interesting proposition.
I was going to say, I thought it was ironic that it happened while he's playing Dungeons and Dragons, because if you take away the historical part of it, it really is nothing but a Dungeons and Dragons tell of, this is what happened, and it's no more real than the Dungeons and Dragon game you just played.
I'd go so far as to say that some of the Dungeons and Dragons games I've played have been way more compelling than the Book of Mormon.
No doubt. No, we recently came across a video from a stake. They're not Trek, but they're putting together something called Quest, where everybody dresses up in Book of Mormon clothing.
Okay.
And they have somebody dressed up like Jesus wandering among them. They do all the events from the Book of Mormon. They have a battle where they're throwing chalk at each other. They have, firesides. It's like this big 3-day event. And we watched it. We were sort of laughing, and then I stopped laughing because I realized this is harmful cosplay. These kids are out here. They were very emotional, especially with the Jesus figure walking among them and hugging all of them. They're dressed up like Nephites and Lamanites, people that never existed, and they're being completely manipulated. It was actually it made me very, very sad to see that. It was a big cosplay, and to inform your entire life on that, it's very sad to me. I don't know. So where in all this was your wife? I don't know if you're comfortable talking about that. You mentioned mixed faith. That's why I brought it up. So
we're in a mixed faith marriage, but her story is hers to tell. So I don't want to go too much into her lived experience within the faith.
Right.
But what I will say is that we examined a lot of these things and spoke for hours together, and we landed in different places. So where my faith was completely eroded, hers was changed. I don't think you can come to the table honestly and come out the other side with the same infantile faith in the LDS church. So it's different than it was when she was younger, but she still does believe in a number of the truth claims. So,
and then you have younger children, so that's an issue too.
Yes.
I mean, that must be interesting to navigate.
Yes, that is interesting to navigate. I will say this: my wife is one of the most mature and compassionate people that I've ever met. She and we are raising our kids without any expectation on them following her or following me or finding whatever other path that they might find in this life. And we're teaching them the things that we individually believe in, but allowing them for the space to internalize them and make the decisions for themselves. That isn't to say that it's not painful for either her or myself, but we're partners. And even though we're coming from different perspectives, the pain that we feel is really similar. And so we can comfort each other in these moments where the one person might be offended by this or that happened, with the children not believing or disagreeing, with this or that, with both me and her. So it's not that there's just been hard things for her or just hard things for me. It's been hard for both of us, but it's deconstructing the LDS faith was very healing for our marriage. It forced us to learn how to communicate with each other. End of sentence there. It forced us to relearn how to communicate with each other and focus on the love that we share and the love that we have for the other person as an individual. I know I'm an outlier. This is probably not going to be the case for all of the listeners. This a mixed faith marriage is hard to navigate. But I just need to say that without my dear wife, it wouldn't be possible. She is so much more mature and intelligent than I am. I just love her to pieces.
So usually when you're in a mixed faith marriage, the thing that you don't do is go start a podcast to talk about deconstruction. But you did that. Yeah. How did that go over?
This is a story. For years, I would listen to podcasts, or I'd buy a book on this or that, grab D. Michael Quinn or Fawn Brody and just devour something. And then for months and months, I would just come to my wife and talk to her. Hey, did you know about this? Or have you, what do you think about that? And it came to the point where we had kind of landed where we were going to land, and she was done talking about it. It was uninteresting to her. She was more focused on her faith in God and her faith in Jesus and her devotions there than she was in nitpicking the history of this or that, or the, historicity of such, XYZ moment in the scriptures. And for me, that stuff was still really fascinating, even as a non-believer. But for her, she was over it and done, and she just wanted to get back to her regular life. She knew that I needed an outlet. And when I told her I was going to start the podcast, I don't think she was fully aware of what the theme of the podcast was going to be, because she listened to the first episode or two and she's like, I don't think this is what we talked about. And I'm like, oh, this is what I thought we talked about.
Did she think it was going to be a D&D podcast? That would have been totally fine, right?
That maybe I'll backtrack a little bit. I do have a D&D podcast with this friend. His name is Paul, who deconstructed the faith. Is that
12-sided guys? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, we looked at that. Guys. We're like, what is that? Oh my gosh.
I thought it was a burger place.
Nope.
We're having an interview 2 for 1. We've got 2 podcasts for 1 in this particular episode. This is awesome.
So about like the beginning of, or right before the pandemic, actually, this was like 2020. My buddy and his twin, so he's a twin, my buddy and his twin and a couple of our friends, we all lived in different places, and we were playing D&D virtually, through Zoom, this sort of a thing. And we just decided one day, like, why aren't we recording this and publishing it? Because we're having so much fun. We're making all these jokes and we're having a blast. And even if the only listeners are like a handful of our friends that listen, like, it would still be a lot of fun to do. It would be a great hobby. So we started it out like that. And we all bought, nice microphones and a full setup, and we started recording. And we've been doing that for about 2.5 years. We finished our first full campaign. It was a 2.5-year campaign. And so a listener that might be familiar with D&D, like that's a pretty long campaign. And very long. It's a long time to play like consistently with the same group of people. So we have the same group that we started with 2.5 years ago as we do finishing it. And we have a blast. We're still going. So we finished the first story, and we're right now starting our next one. So go listen to it. 12-sided guys. It's a blast if you're interested in that sort of thing. But I had all this podcasting gear. I'm doing this other podcast with my friends, and I'm discussing with my wife, like, hey, I've got so much more that I want to think about. I'm reading XYZ. I've already got all the podcasting gear. Like, why don't I just sit down 20-30 minutes, every couple of, once or twice a week, and just like talk about my thoughts, and maybe someone will be interested in that. And so I recorded 3 episodes. My first 3 episodes, I recorded them, edited them, got them all ready, and then I didn't publish anything yet. I decided to reach out to Bill Reel, and I was like, hey, Bill, I just like shot him a message like, hey, you don't know me from Adam. I'm just some random guy. I respect what you're doing. Love to pick your brain for a minute. If you have a sec, I'd love to ask you some questions about doing a podcast in this niche, like in the Mormon, post-Mormon realm. He gave me a phone call. Bill is a fantastic human being. He gave me a lot of his time. We talked it through. And by the end of it, he's like, hey, why don't you send me what you've got? I'm looking to bring on some podcasters. And I was like, that was not my intention of like reaching out to you. But if you're interested, I think I would love to work for you. And so I sent him the first couple, and he was like, "Hey, I think you're onto something here. You're hitting a demographic that kind of gets skipped over with what I was trying to do." And the rest is history. So I've been doing Rameumptom Ruminations for 2 years now. So I started in June of 2021, actually. So when I said the demographic that I'm shooting for, I typically try and approach any subject as if my wife were like sitting right next to me listening, where I know that some of the things that I'm saying will probably like bother her or make her really frustrated, but I try and phrase it in a way where I'm making it as approachable as possible for a believer, or a newly doubting member, or someone who maybe is a cafeteria Mormon, which everyone is a cafeteria Mormon, by the way.
Agreed.
I try and record and talk about my subjects as if she were in the room with me, and if I'm bouncing off ideas to her, sometimes I'll bring stuff up to her. Not super often. She still doesn't like to talk about religion with me, but I'll see what she thinks and kind of use that as like a sounding board for where I approach a subject from the perspective of a believer. But yeah, that's.
Does she listen? Does your wife listen to your podcast?
She has listened, and she listens on occasion, but it usually doesn't go well. It's hard for her because I'm talking about things that are very important to her and to her faith.
Sure.
And while I'm not trying to be facetious or joke about any of the things that I'm talking about, it is painful for her to see the things that I'm talking about sometimes. And so so she's proud of me. She's really proud of the effort that I put in and how I've built it and developed this tone and an audience, but it's not something that she listens to.
How'd you choose the name Rameumptom Ruminations?
Again,
great name.
I have to give credit to my friend Paul. So I told him, I'm like, hey, I'm thinking about doing a podcast, and I had a couple of names in mind, and we're just joking around and talking, and he was like, I was making the comment, kind of like the joke that I said in the bio that you guys read. I'm like, that I'm just some random guy, I'm just talking, whatever thoughts are in my head, and I'm nobody important, and so nobody really has to listen to me. And he's like, why don't you just say it's like ruminations from your Rameumptom instead of like from your ass? And I'm like, that's pretty good. And so
that is good.
I was thinking about it, and I'm like, it's a little too tongue-in-cheek for the tone that I'm trying to set, and so then I just shortened it to Rameumptom Ruminations.
Yeah, it rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, a little alliteration
after a little
practice. For you. Yeah.
No, that is great. So, and do you have guests on sometimes? Do you talk
to
other
guests
people?
on. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking. Why don't you tell us just some of the just to give people a flavor, some of the topics or some of the guests?
So I'll talk about whatever I'm thinking about. If something happens in the news, I'm not usually the first to report on it. So don't come to Rameumptom Ruminations, for your news about the LDS Church. Come to me after you've read that to maybe think about some of the stuff, like with all the SEC allegations against the church. I was not the first to talk about it, but I did talk about it for 3 or 4 weeks. And the perspectives that I was going at that subject were, when has a prophet ever lied, or is it okay for a prophet to lie according to the scriptures? What's the precedent for it, and what implications does that maybe have on the LDS Church? And so I kind of come at it from I try to come at every subject from a unique angle to encourage the listener to think critically about the subject. I don't try to tell them to think the way I do. I try to encourage people to push back or send a comment of like, hey, I disagreed with what you said here. So don't come to me for current events, but I do talk about current event things. I do have guests on occasionally, not super often. I've brought on a former adjunct faculty to BYU who was basically fired from BYU because she was teaching in church things that weren't perfectly in line with the correlated material, and her bishop kind of had a vendetta against her didn't recommend her, and so she lost her employment at the school. I brought on a guy who worked at church headquarters, basically in market research for the church. He conducted surveys for the church to gather information to help influence the decisions that the church makes as a whole, or to see what the new initiatives, how they were being received by different people around the world. So usually when I bring on a guest, I'm not trying to compete with Mormon stories. And so my guests, when I bring them on, I like them to have an interesting subject that after the interview, I can kind of dissect and do a couple of episodes on, this person said that, let's think or talk about that subject for a little bit. So I've had on a number of guests. I brought Patrick Mason on, and that was a fantastic chat. We talked about like coming to the table with like a nuanced belief, and how a nuanced believer can interact with the members in their congregation safely, without maybe outing themselves as, not a standard Mormon. So those are some of the episodes I've done. I try to incorporate the literature that I'm reading or some of the philosophy that I'm thinking about in most of the episodes that I do, just because that's the way that I perceive the world. And so I'm just kind of, whatever I'm thinking about in the weeks preceding the episode, that's what I'm going to talk about.
It's a rumination. You're absolutely correct. So, no, and I love it that you live in both spaces, in a mixed faith. I'm assuming you probably have a lot of friends, a ward, a neighborhood. So you're in these spaces and you're able to podcast about this, which is so invaluable because many of us live in both spaces, some better than others, right? I mean, it can be really rough. And so to listen to you, it kind of maybe even gives you some tools to be able to interact and be more comfortable in both spaces. So I can see why Bill instantly said, oh, this is something. No, it's something. That's what I love about his whole umbrella, is that he has something for everyone, and people in this situation where you're in the different spaces, it's really important to know how to navigate it and not knee jerk, know how to talk about, because there are ways that you can talk across a difference divide. And I love the concept that you think, my wife's sitting here right next to me, so let me talk about that. I don't know how I'd podcast if I was thinking my husband was sitting right next to me, because he's very nuanced and pretty much out. But it's always a dicey. But no, I love that. Would you say that even, I mean, from your description and some of the ones that I've listened to, I feel like even maybe a nuanced or progressive member would probably, like you said, Patrick, would benefit from listening to you too, because it's maybe a safer space to understand what they consider the other point of view, right? The other. But when you listen to it, a lot of times you realize that's not so far off from what I think. I know a lot of faithful members that were very disturbed by the SEC. That was something that they were trying to wrap their head around. So we're not that far apart, I don't feel. And I think your podcast definitely shows that.
Yeah, I don't want to say that the tone of other podcasts is wrong or harmful. I think that there's space for humor, there's space for anger and frustration, there's space to dance on TikTok with your garments on. There's space for all of the things,
right?
But a newly doubting person, or even an active believing member, they might want to discuss those things. They might feel like they can't discuss them though in the context of their chapel or with their loved ones without repercussion. They probably couldn't bring these things up without someone assuming that they're not all the way in. So the space I'm trying to create is intentional to be welcoming to both the believer and the non-believer alike.
That's an important one to have, because in fact, that's how I met Rebecca. Was for 3 years I had nowhere to go, and I was in a mixed faith marriage, and I'm like, I can't say anything in my own home. How do I express what I'm thinking, or how do I find people who agree with me? And when you finally find someone who you can have that conversation with where you can share your full thoughts and what you're really going through without being judged, that's an important find. And when a podcast can do that, that's an important role.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And in our case, of course, we found each other online and started a book club called the Good Book Club to help people read as they deconstructed.
Yeah.
Sort of with the philosophy that now we know what we don't believe. Let's try to figure out what we do by reading, And so that was very cathartic and helpful, And we had people, to this day, we have nuanced people in the book club. It's still going 3 years later. We're kind of stunned,
cool.
It's just amazing that, and we read a lot of the books you just mentioned. I was going to point, they're all back here, all kinds of books, not even directly related to Mormonism, but through the lens of Mormonism, because it's such a universal way to connect and to read. And we have a sitting high councilman in our book club who led one of our discussions from his car between meetings. You know what I mean? He chose to lead the Luna Lindsay's Recovering Agency, which after that, I don't know if you're familiar with that. He was like, I'm looking at things in a different way. But again, that's okay, and that space is needed, whether to come and read with somebody or to find a podcast where somebody is voicing some of what can be seen as when you have those thoughts, I think you're scared and you're thinking, why am I thinking this? What does this mean? What will this mean? Here's somebody who's discussing things, in a safe, calm way that you can maybe help process and either deconstruct, maybe reconstruct. You don't know. I mean, I would guess that your mission statement, well, why don't you tell us what you think the mission statement of your podcast is? It's probably not, I'm dragging people out, it's not that. So
I've never sat down and thought of like an actual mission statement for what I'm doing, because it's just as much for me as it is for the listeners to put my thoughts in order and make them presentable, because that helps me think and process information. But if I were to say a mission statement, it would just be to create content that is approachable for both a believer and a non-believer, in a way where they can take their own autonomy or ownership of the information and make informed decisions for their own life. And not that I should influence it in one way or another, but that everyone should have this information and be able to think critically about it. And what they do with that information is their choice, but it should be there for everyone and approachable for everyone.
Well, now you have a mission statement. We'll just roll back tape, transcribe it, and you've got it right there. You can make a plaque or a flag and hang it in your front yard, or whatever you want to do. Oh, that's funny. So what going forward? What do you see? What do you have planned? Do you have any guest plan, or is it just, I guess maybe that's a question. What's your process? Do you just wake up in the morning and think, the Wall Street Journal just put out a big article again about finance. Maybe I'll ruminate on that in a couple of days. Is that kind of you? It sounds like you're pretty agile, which is great.
Yeah, I do have guests, and I've usually got one or two people that we're working on an outline with, and we're talking or trying to schedule with. But those, like, I probably only do like 8 to 10 interviews a year, so that's not the majority of my content, and I put out between 45 to 50 episodes a year, so I usually only take off 6 weeks of the year without actually publishing content, usually. And maybe this is behind the scenes, it's usually when I'm having like a really bad mental health week. I'll just put everything down and I need to reset, and however long that takes, then I jump back on board. So for the listeners, if I haven't published something in the week, it's because I'm having a really bad week.
Oh, so it means send brownies. Everybody send brownies to Scott or something, or think good thoughts to the universe if you don't see him publishing. So
because even after all of the stuff and the healing and the growing, I still do have depression, and it's still something that's part of my life. It's healthier and more manageable, but it's still here. So my process is, I do a fair amount of driving. I really enjoy driving, and I'll listen to podcasts or I'll listen to audiobooks, and I'm always looking for something to talk about. My interests are really varied. And so I might be listening to a theology podcast or audiobook and thinking about, hey, what can I incorporate from this that I'm learning into Rameumptom Ruminations, or what that I'm listening to now would be helpful for the listener. As an example, one of the podcasts I listen to, and make a plug for the listeners, is called History This Week, and they did an episode a couple weeks ago about Mary Shelley, and it had been well over a decade since I'd read Frankenstein, and I'm like, you know what, I should pick up Frankenstein again, because it was a fantastic book. I loved it so much, and I've been rereading it, and while I'm reading Frankenstein, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, this Frankenstein's lived experience is the lived experience of the LGBTQ plus members of the church. And I'm listening to not Frankenstein, the monster. The monster's lived experience is the experience of the LGBTQ plus members of the LDS church. So whenever the monster's talking, I'm just like, all of these emotions that he's feeling and his frustrations with Frankenstein are everything that I have heard expressed from those members of the church. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, oh my God, this is a huge connection. So now I'm giving you behind the scenes. So I just reread that and I'm like, okay, I need to do an episode or two talking about that connection there. And I dive way too deep into things. I bought a biography of Mary Shelley. I'd learned a little bit about her in college, but I didn't like dive too deep. So I watched a documentary on her with my wife because she loves this stuff too. So we sit down, we watch the documentary, and then I bought a biography of Mary Shelley. So I've been learning about her life and I'm going to say almost nothing that I'm learning, but so that sort of thing is just for me. But that's kind of the process. Like I'll dive into something really deep and then I'll make a 20 minute episode about it, or I'll make 2 or 3 episodes discussing what I was thinking about while reading those stories. So sometimes I won't ever reference what I was reading, but this one I will. But anyway, so that's kind of my process. As far as outlines go, I'll just write like a quote like, hey, this is what the monster said and I think it's really important, and then talk about that. And then that's like the extent of my outline.
Oh, well, now I can't wait for that episode or series of episodes. That's an incredible comparison. Yeah, I haven't read Frankenstein since. Have you ever read Frankenstein, Landon? I haven't read it since high school, I don't think. But yeah, the whole completely disenfranchised and the frustration and and seeing it through new eyes, the lens that you're looking at it through now. That's wow, what a comparison. That's very provocative.
Mary Shelley was acquainted with grief. She and her husband, she ran away with her husband and he was already married. And then his ex-wife threw herself into the Thames. Mary had like her first child died a couple days after I can't remember if it was a boy or a girl. Anyway, her first child died like pretty recently after it was born. And so death and all of these things were kind of like ruminating in her mind. And then she writes this book and it is so full of grief. Like it is, anytime the monster speaks, it is like the most like gut-wrenching lived experience. And it is just like she's putting all of her depression and all of her like anguish onto the mind of the monster. And it is just absolutely beautiful. It's so if you're referring to this as like the movie or some of like the modern interpretations of Frankenstein and the monster, like that is not the story at all. The story is Frankenstein creates this monster, brings it to life, and is disgusted with it, sees how horrifying it is, and immediately runs away. And then the monster, this baby, is like, what's going on with this world? He immediately abandoned from the moment of his birth. And it's such a great read. I love books. I love movies. I could talk about that stuff all day long.
Well, you're in the right place. We could too. The Mormonish media moment. Maybe
there we
go. Start that too. There's so much to talk about. So, wow. Well, do you have any final thoughts or questions, Landon? This has just been a wonderful, wonderful interview. I just love it.
No, it's been great talking to Scott and get to know him better. And yeah, he's got a great podcast. He's got a great voice for podcasting.
I know.
It's very soothing as you listen to his.
I feel that way.
His episodes.
I feel very pleasant. I know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, and that's why we're telling everybody, please, and we'll link everything in the show notes to both of the podcasts that we talked about today, because now we know there's a D&D one for all of us geeky people out there. Yep. And in fact, this is
I'm a lot less serious in that one.
A lot less serious.
In Rameumptom Ruminations, I don't make jokes too often, but in 12-Sided Guys, you'll get a better picture of what my personality is.
Scott will come out. So I have to laugh because I really talk about D&D. And so I have a character that I've had for a while that's kind of a play. My middle name is Wilhelmina. My actual real name is Wilhelmina. So my character is an elf, warrior goddess princess named Willabella, right? So I was talking to the backyard professor about this, who's also geeked out of his mind. And he's like, I'm totally going to paint, because he's also a fabulous artist. He's like, I'm going to paint your character. And I'm like, what? And so he's literally putting the finishing touches on it right now, my elf, Willabella. And he's going to make this incredible painting for me. I can't even believe it.
Yeah. So I also, this weekend.
I also
this
paint
weekend,
miniatures. That's one of
Oh
my
my
hobbies. So I do that
Look
same
at
sort of thing.
that. Oh my gosh.
But
Yeah, we have now gone to another realm. Mormonish viewers who are not in this world, this is how it is.
Like
But
Star
yeah, it's
Trek
really
wasn't
fun.
bad enough.
Well, yes, I also
now
have.
it's Dungeons and Dragons too.
that's right.
I actually run a Facebook and Instagram asset called Trexmo, which is Star Trek memes for post-Mormons, where we look at Mormonism through the lens of Star Trek pictures. It's actually really, really cathartic. It's almost my favorite thing to do. You know, like today I made one of bones and a lovely lady standing there, and the caption was, "Oh, we invite all of you to come stand outside of our temple wedding. It'll mean so much to, there's just a way to kind of process through these other mediums, that really help you. And humor, hopefully not too snarky, but it's cathartic, I find. So it's great.
There's a space for it. There's a space for everything.
There's a space for it. Let's just say that. And we've talked about a lot of spaces today. So, well, wonderful. We would like to thank Scott for coming on, and we encourage everybody to check out every single thing we've talked about. Read Frankenstein, go to Rameumptom Ruminations, go to his other podcasts. We're going to link all this in the show notes so that you can go back and dive into what we've talked about. So we'd also love it if you can like and subscribe to Mormonish. And if you would like to be notified when the new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell. And we finally did figure out people have asked us, how can we donate or support you guys? We finally figured it out. We have some links to PayPal and to Venmo. Awesome. I know we're boomer technology here. So if anybody wants to support the channel, go ahead and do that. We love and appreciate you guys. And also please check out all of Scott's wonderful work. We're all out there just trying to make spaces, as Scott said, for people where they feel comfortable, wherever that may be, to make their lives more positive. So thanks again from Mormonish and from Scott, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.